I ask call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to return to Coburn Amendment number 3371.
Without objection.
I ask that the
amendment is now pending, sir.
I ask that that amendment be modified with the changes I now send to the desk.
Without objection. The amendment is so modified.
Mr. President, I ask this time the amendment be divided in the form which I now send to the desk.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to talk about Coburn 3372. Actually, that's not the correct one. I'd like to talk about Division 1, which has to do with per capita damage indicators and initiating a rule process to update it. The state of Oklahoma in the last 7 years has had more declarations of disaster named than any other state in the country. And the standard used to be is if we have an overwhelming disaster that overwhelms the ability of the state to handle it. And we've gotten away from that. And this hadn't been updated since 1986. And so what this amendment does under the Stafford Act of 1988, the whole purpose of our emergency response was for us to step in and provide assistance when state and local capabilities are overwhelmed. It is clear that in New York and New Jersey, and in communities that were affected by this latest storm, state and local capabilities have been overwhelmed. It's clearly an appropriate time for the federal government, through the Federal Emergency Management System Agency, to step in and provide assistance. Unfortunately, FEMA has been declaring an increasing number of disasters over the past 2 decades, including for many storms and many events where the state and local capacities weren't overwhelmed. Let me make that statement again. Many of the disasters that have been declared were declared when state and local capabilities were not overwhelmed at all. So we're sitting with this tremendous debt, we're sitting with tremendous deficits, and we're now applying a lower standard than what we should, in my mind. And it's not just my opinion. The GAO has actually studied this. We have a GAO report that says this ought to be modified. And so what we're trying to do is to look at, if you go back in history and look at the Reagan administration, on average, they declared 28 events each year in the 80s. Under the current administration, we are averaging 140 disaster declarations a year. My state, as I said, has had the most FEMA disaster declarations, 25 in total. So that what I'm offering isn't necessarily going to be beneficial for my state, but it makes great common sense for our country. Because if, in fact, they update the per capita effect, some of those that had been declared disasters in Oklahoma probably would not. And let me give you an example. In 2011, we felt a little tremble here in Washington from an earthquake. A disaster declaration was declared for Virginia after the earthquake that was felt here in the Capitol. But this wasn't a disaster that overwhelmed local capabilities. It didn't overwhelm the capabilities of the regional capital area. It didn't overwhelm the capabilities of Virginia. Yet we transferred what were truly responsibilities for the state and communities to the federal government. So this per capita damage indicator ends up becoming really problematic for 2 reasons. First, it was established in '86, but FEMA has failed to update it. And second, simply using a per capita damage indicator is an unfair way to assess whether or not a disaster has occurred. And let me explain why. If you have a small populated state versus a large populated state, where you have a concentration of people in an area, you won't ever attain it if you have a large population. Whereas if you have a small population, you will, with the exact same event. So my question is should Oklahoma benefit on a per capita basis? The same event happened in Oklahoma as happens in Los Angeles. And we get declared an emergency and Los Angeles doesn't. And that's what's happened to us as we've not updated this per capita damage indicator. It's really unfair for the large and more populous states that we do it this way. And so all we're saying is take the GAO report and follow some of the recommendations. And what are they? FEMA to review the per capita damage indicator and initiate a rulemaking to modernize it. It would require the FEMA administrator to update the per capita damage indicator for all the years since 1996 by no later than January 1st of 2016. All right? So we're going to give them over 3 years to update it. Second, the amendment requires the FEMA administrator to report to Congress on better and fairer ways to assess states' preparedness and capabilities to respond to a disaster. And then finally, what I would say is this is really a reasonable approach based on what GAO's analysis and recommendations were to encourage FEMA to update its process for how it declares disasters so that we can reserve and focus more aid on severe disasters, just like Sandy, that's in front of us right now. It's my belief that although this may divide some in this chamber, this is a smart thing for us to do for the country. It's a fair thing for us to do to everybody, every state, to treat them all the same instead of advantage the smaller states, like my state, and take a disadvantage the larger states. And I'd be happy to work with the chairman to modify this in a way that would meet with his approval, but it's something that's sorely lacking. It's something that's causing us to intercede at times when we shouldn't be and causing us to not intercede at times that we should. And I would yield the floor.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I suggest you have to the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.